Okay, so you want to own a school, buy some land, put up a building, hire some teachers, and watch tuition checks roll in every single month for the next 30 years. Thousands of kids in uniforms, a waiting list a mile long. It looks like the closest thing to a guaranteed cash machine that exists in America. Here's the problem. Almost none of that is true, and the part that is true is a lot more brutal than it looks from the parking lot. What you're actually signing up for is a business that blends real estate development, human resources at scale, government licensing, consumer psychology, and a customer relationship that can last 12 years or longer with a single family. Some people who buy into this business become extraordinarily wealthy. Others lose everything they put in, and they lose it slowly, in a way that looks fine right up until it doesn't. So let's take this apart piece by piece, the way an operator actually has to see it, not the way it looks from the outside. First, a quick note on what kind of school we're even talking about, because the funding model changes everything about how the business actually behaves. Public schools run on tax dollars, so a public administrator never has to ask whether enrollment covers payroll. Religious schools often run on tuition plus a church subsidy. International and boarding schools serve a wealthier, less price-sensitive customer. Franchise networks split revenue with a corporate parent in exchange for a proven playbook. But the purest version of this business, the one where every dollar of risk sits on one owner's shoulders, is the independently owned, for-profit, or standalone nonprofit private school. That's the version we're breaking down here because that's the version where the economics are unforgiving in both directions. The scale of this market alone is worth sitting with for a second. All of K through 12 education combined, public and private, is a market worth roughly $634 billion a year in the United States. Private schools educate a bit over 11 million students nationwide, compared to nearly 63 million in public schools, a genuinely enormous industry hiding behind a very small, very local, very personal feeling storefront. Let's start with the part nobody thinks about first, the dirt underneath the building. A school does not begin with a classroom. It begins with a real estate decision, and that decision alone can bankrupt you before a single student ever shows up. In a major American metro area, a usable parcel large enough to hold a full campus, classrooms, a gym, a parking lot, and outdoor space regularly runs into the millions of dollars before a single brick is laid. Push out to the suburbs, and the price per acre drops, sometimes by half or more, but now you've traded cash for something else, distance. Every mile you move away from the wealthy families who can actually afford private tuition is a mile that shows up later as a bus route, a longer commute, and a parent quietly deciding the school across town is more convenient. So already, before construction, before hiring, before a single lesson plan, you're choosing between two expensive problems. Pay a fortune for land close to your customers, or pay less for land and then spend the next 10 years fighting the distance. And it's not just about the price tag on the land. It's about what the land is legally allowed to become. Zoning boards decide whether a parcel can even host a school at all, and that approval process alone can take a year or two of public hearings, traffic studies, and neighborhood objections before anyone touches a shovel. A property that looks like a bargain on a real estate listing can quietly become one of the most expensive purchases you'll ever make. Once you add the carrying costs of paying interest on that land for 2 years while lawyers fight over a rezoning application that may or may not ultimately be approved. Now here's where it gets interesting. Say you've got your land, you've got your zoning approval, and you're ready to build. Building an actual school is nothing like building a house, and the price tag proves it immediately. According to national construction data tracked by firms like Ryder Levitt Bucknall and cost estimators such as Cumming, building a new K through 12 school in the United States runs somewhere between $230 and roughly $600 per square foot, depending on the city, the labor market, and the specifications. Nashville sits near the low end. New York City sits near the top. Broken down by grade level, a typical elementary school averages close to $300 per square foot, a middle school closer to $325, and a full high school, with its larger gyms and more complex labs, averages around $360 a square foot nationally. Before you even step into an expensive coastal market, a mid-size elementary school of about 75,000 square feet, at even a modest $385 a square foot, lands you at close to $29 million. And that number can climb past 60 million once you're inside a market with strict seismic codes or union labor requirements, like large parts of California. A full high school campus in the 250 to 400,000 square foot range that most large high schools require runs anywhere from $100 million to $200 million in construction costs alone, before land, before furniture, before a single teacher is hired. And that's before you've added a single specialty room. A cafeteria and assembly space combined, what the industry calls a cafetorium, adds 1.7 to almost $4 million on its own. A full competition gymnasium with bleachers and locker rooms can add another 5 to 13 million. Science labs need proper ventilation, gas lines, and eyewash stations. A library, security systems, fire suppression sprinklers, an emergency generator, ramps and elevators for accessibility compliance. None of that is optional, and none of it is cheap. On top of the actual construction contract, you then have to budget for furniture, fixtures and equipment, low-voltage technology wiring, architectural and engineering fees, and permit reviews, which alone typically eat up another 18 to 25% of the total project cost. On a $50 million building, that's another $9 to $12.5 million that never shows up in the headline construction number. People quote to each other. One real district in the middle of the country found this out the hard way. Voters approved $48 million for a new elementary school. By the time the design was finished 2 years later, the estimate had grown to almost $60 million, an $11.5 million gap that appeared without anyone building a single wall. That gap didn't come from fraud or mismanagement. It came from something far more ordinary. The 2 years it takes to plan a building are 2 years in which materials, labor, and land don't sit still. The district eventually closed that gap the only way you can once the money is already spent on planning. 14 separate cost-cutting decisions, from switching to a single-story slab-on-grade design instead of a 2-story structure, to swapping premium flooring for polished concrete in the main hallways, to replacing an oversized mechanical system with a simpler standard spec version, clawing back over $11 million in 11 weeks of frantic redesign, just to make the number match the bond that voters had already approved. So here's the first trap. The number in your head when you decide to build a school is never the number you actually pay. It's the number from the day you started planning, and construction inflation doesn't wait for your permits to clear. Construction costs in the school sector have climbed by roughly 15% over just the past 3 years nationally, and in fast-growing metro markets, the jump has been even sharper. A project that pencils out perfectly on day one can be underwater by the time the foundation is poured, which is exactly why experienced developers build a contingency of 10 to 20% directly into their construction budget from the start. And even once the building is finished, you still can't open the doors. This is the part almost every new operator underestimates. A finished, beautiful, fully equipped school building is legally worthless until the state says otherwise. You need fire marshal sign-off, health department clearance on your kitchen and water systems, and your state's Department of Education to approve your curriculum and verify your teacher's credentials. Depending on the state, you may also need a separate business license, special zoning approval for an educational use designation, and a waiting period before you're even allowed to advertise. Accreditation through a regional body often takes an entire academic year of self-study and committee review before it's granted. And without it, families chasing financial aid or college placement credibility may simply look elsewhere. Miss any single piece of this, and you don't get a warning. You get a shutdown order, and shutdown orders after you've already paid for a $50 million building are about the most expensive mistake a person can make in American small business. Every month your opening is delayed by a missing permit is a month where your construction loan is still accruing interest, your newly hired staff are on payroll with nobody to teach, and your marketing spend is quietly burning down with 0 students walking through the door. Delay a September opening into November, and you haven't just lost 2 months of tuition. You've lost the entire academic year because very few families pull a child mid-semester to enroll somewhere new. Now let's talk about the part everybody assumes they already understand. Where the money actually comes from. Most people think a school makes money from tuition, full stop. That's true, but it's incomplete. Tuition is the engine, typically 70 to 90% of total revenue at most private schools, but it is not the whole car. On top of tuition, schools charge one-time admission fees just to process an application, sometimes running several $100s, and charged whether or not the student is ultimately accepted. They charge annual registration and activity fees to cover lab materials, library access, and standardized testing. Many schools license their brand to a uniform manufacturer or sell branded gear directly, capturing a retail markup that has nothing to do with teaching. Transportation is its own recurring monthly charge for any family that uses the bus. The cafeteria either generates direct food sales or gets leased out to a vendor who pays rent and a percentage of revenue back to the school. And after the final bell rings, the same classrooms and gyms get rented out for after-school sports academies, music lessons, and summer camps, squeezing extra revenue out of a building that would otherwise sit completely empty for half the day and entirely empty for 3 months a year. Layer all of that together, and a single enrolled student is worth far more than their tuition check alone. A family paying $15,000 in tuition might realistically hand the school another $1,000 to $3,000 a year in transportation, food, activity fees, and summer programs combined. Money that comes with almost no incremental cost to deliver, since the bus, the kitchen, and the gym already exist either way. This is why the smartest operators think in terms of total revenue per family, not tuition per student, and why a school with a mediocre tuition sticker price but an excellent summer camp and after-school program can sometimes out-earn a rival, charging thousands more per year in tuition alone. So how do you actually set the tuition number? This is where the psychology gets strange. You'd think schools would price based on their actual cost to educate a child, plus a reasonable margin. Some do. But at the premium end of the market, tuition often behaves like what economists call a Veblen good, a product where raising the price can actually increase demand, because the price itself signals exclusivity. According to the National Association of Independent Schools, median day school tuition for a member school now sits close to $30,000 a year, up from roughly $14,600 2 decades ago, more than doubling in a period when overall inflation rose by far less. High-end boarding schools average over $60,000 a year. Meanwhile, in states like Kansas or Kentucky, average private tuition sits closer to $10,000, while Connecticut, driven by wealth concentration, holds the highest state average at close to $29,000, same country. Same basic product, at least on paper. A 3 times difference in price, driven almost entirely by brand, geography, and local family income rather than the actual cost of teaching a child arithmetic. This is why lowering your price is often the worst move a struggling private school can make. Parents don't read a tuition cut as a bargain. They read it as a warning sign, a signal that the school can't attract good teachers or wealthy families, and that something underneath must be wrong. So instead of cutting the sticker price, most schools do the opposite. They keep the list price high for brand purposes, and then quietly discount it through financial aid for the students they actually want to attract. Across NAIA's member schools, a bit over 1 in 4 students now receive some form of financial aid, with median grants north of $22,000 per recipient, and boarding school aid recipients receiving an average grant above $35,000 a year. This lets a school protect its sticker price brand identity while still quietly competing on price behind the scenes, one negotiated financial aid letter at a time, without ever having to publicly admit that a third of its incoming class is paying meaningfully less than the number printed in the brochure. Now here's the number that actually decides whether any of this survives. How many seats are filled? This is the single most dangerous variable in the entire business, because almost every real cost in a school is fixed, and almost none of it cares how many students actually show up. A classroom built for 30 kids costs the same to heat, staff, and ensure whether it holds 30 kids or 18. Let's run the math the way an operator actually has to run it. Say a mid-sized private school charges a sticker tuition of $15,000 a year, and on average discounts that by 15% through financial aid, leaving net tuition of $12,750 per student. Add in roughly $750 per student in profit from transportation, food, and camps. Subtract about $1,200 per student in variable costs, materials, utilities, lab supplies. That leaves a contribution of $12,300 per enrolled student. Now say that school's fixed costs, the lease or mortgage, full-time salaries, insurance, security, run $3,690,000 a year, whether one student shows up or 400 do. Divide the fixed cost by the contribution per student, and you get your break-even enrollment. 300 students. If the physical building holds 400 seats, here's what the same fixed cost structure looks like as enrollment slides. At full capacity, 400 students, the school clears close to $1.6 million in surplus, drop to 350 students, 87.5% full, and the surplus falls to under 1 million. Hit exactly 300 students, and the school breaks even with zero profit and zero cushion. Slip to 250 students, just under 2/3 full, and the school is now losing about $250,000 a year, forced to draw down whatever cash reserve it has. Fall to 200 students, half capacity, and the annual loss balloons past $850,000. A level of bleeding that very few schools survive for more than a year or two. Notice something about that progression. The jump from full to almost full barely moves the number. The jump from 3/4 full to 2/3 full is where the entire business flips from healthy to insolvent. That's why school operators obsess over what's called the capacity utilization rate, and why the real target for financial safety sits between 70 and 85% occupancy, not somewhere in the 90s. A school running near 90% full might feel like a success story to the head of admissions, but to the finance office, it actually means something a little alarming. There's almost no room left to absorb a single bad enrollment year before the whole model crosses into deficit territory. Full is not always safe. Full just means you're one recession away from a very steep drop, and there's a strange irony hiding inside a fully enrolled waiting list school. The very success that makes a school desirable enough to fill every seat is also what strips out its own margin of safety. And what's the biggest single driver of those fixed costs that never go away, no matter how many seats are empty? People, this is not a business you can automate your way out of. Nationwide data on independent schools shows that personnel, teacher salaries, benefits, payroll taxes, support staff, administration, consistently eats up somewhere between 70 and 90% of a school's entire operating budget. Broken down further, a bit over half of every tuition dollar, around 53 to 63%, depending on the school, goes directly to instructional salaries and support staff pay. Another 12 to 13% goes to benefits and payroll tax on top of that. Physical plant costs, supplies, technology, and debt service are left splitting whatever's left over, typically under 30% of the entire budget. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, private school teachers are actually paid less on average than their public school counterparts, not more. Median pay for a private elementary school teacher sits around $47,500 a year, compared to roughly $61,800 for a public elementary school teacher. Private high school teachers average around $56,500 versus roughly $62,000 for public high school teachers. The gap exists because public schools generally require a state license and structured pay scales tied to tenure, while private schools set their own hiring bar and rarely offer union protection. At the elite end of the market, this flips entirely. Some of the most prestigious private prep schools pay experienced teachers well over $100,000 a year specifically to poach talent away from public schools. But at the median, the uncomfortable truth is that private education in America runs partly on teachers accepting lower pay in exchange for smaller classes and more autonomy. This is also why a school's student-to-teacher ratio is both its best marketing tool and its biggest financial risk at the same time. Parents love a low ratio. 12 students per teacher sounds far more attractive than 25 per teacher. But every student you subtract from a classroom without raising tuition is a direct cut into your own margin. National data comparing schools running a surplus against schools running a deficit shows a small but consistent gap. Surplus schools average about 4.6 students per employee and 7.3 students per teacher, while deficit schools sit lower, at 4.3 per employee and 6.7 per teacher. That's a tiny difference on paper. In dollar terms, across an entire payroll, it's the difference between solvency and a slow bleed. A school that markets itself on an 8-to-1 ratio is quietly promising its own finance department a permanent uphill fight. And the only way that promise survives long term is if the tuition sticker price is high enough to cover the extra teachers that ratio requires. Beyond the classroom, a full private school payroll also includes a head of school, and often several assistant or division heads, a director of admissions, a business or finance officer, registrar, school counselors, a nurse, librarians, teaching assistants, and a full facilities team of janitorial staff, groundskeepers, and security personnel. None of these roles generate tuition revenue directly, and all of them are effectively fixed costs that exist whether the school is at 40% capacity or 95%. Now let's talk about a cost most people never even think to ask about. What happens every summer when the building is empty? Because it isn't actually empty in any way that saves money. Security has to run 24 hours a day whether or not students are inside. The HVAC system can't just be switched off for 2 months without risking mold growth and structural damage from humidity. So climate control keeps running at reduced but real cost. Software subscriptions for the learning management system, the student database, and the accounting platform bill monthly whether or not anyone logs in. Senior administrators, the principal, the finance officer, the director of admissions, are on year-round contracts, not 9-month ones. And the buses that sat idle all June still need their annual safety inspections and maintenance before the fall semester starts. A school doesn't get 8 months of expenses and 4 months of rest. It gets 12 months of expenses and roughly 9 months of revenue, which is exactly why every well-run school treats cash reserves as a survival tool, not a luxury, collecting tuition well in advance in quarterly or even monthly installments, specifically to smooth over the months when the building is quiet but the bills are not. A school with 3 to 6 months of operating expenses sitting in reserve can absorb a rough summer without panic. A school running close to zero reserve is one delayed vendor payment away from a genuinely dangerous cash crunch, even if its long-term enrollment outlook is perfectly fine. Let's zoom in on one of these ongoing costs that sounds small until you actually run the numbers. Transportation. The average American school district spends somewhere between $1,100 and $1,545 per year per student just on transportation, a figure that has risen by more than 27% over the past decade. A single new diesel school bus costs anywhere from $40,000 to $150,000 depending on size, and annual maintenance alone averages around $5,500 per bus before fuel, insurance, and driver wages. Rural operators face an even steeper penalty. The marginal cost of transporting one additional student runs roughly 2.5 times higher than in an urban district. A private school operator faces the same choice every public district faces. Run the fleet yourself and absorb the capital cost and liability directly, or contract it out and pay someone else a markup to take on the risk. Neither option is free, and in a nationwide labor market where qualified school bus drivers have declined by over 15% in recent years, simply finding enough licensed drivers has become its own headache separate from the cost itself. There's also a cost most first-time operators never think to budget for until their insurance broker mentions it. Liability. A school is legally responsible for the physical safety of every child on its property, on its buses, and on its field trips for 6 to 8 hours a day. That requires general liability coverage, property insurance on a building that may have cost $50 million to construct, automobile coverage on the bus fleet, and increasingly, cyber liability coverage to cover the fallout if a ransomware attack exposes thousands of students' financial and medical records. None of these are optional line items you can shop away. A single serious injury lawsuit without adequate coverage can wipe out a small school's entire annual surplus. Technology is another line item that used to be optional and now simply isn't. The global K-12 education technology market was valued at over $45 billion this year alone, and is projected to grow past $325 billion by 2035. A private school today is expected to provide a learning management system one-to-one devices for every student at somewhere between $325 and $485 per student per year, and increasingly some form of AI-based learning or assessment software, since more than half of American K-12 schools now use one. None of this shows up in the glossy brochure photo of kids sitting under a tree reading books, but all of it shows up on the monthly credit card statement. And cybersecurity has become its own dedicated budget line. And technology bleeds directly into another cost center that barely existed a generation ago: marketing and enrollment management. Because the private school market is intensely competitive within any given metro area, schools can no longer simply rely on word of mouth to fill seats. Admissions departments track their own version of a metric borrowed straight from Silicon Valley: student acquisition cost weighed against the lifetime value of a family who stays enrolled for years. If a school spends roughly $1,200 to acquire a single new student, and that student stays enrolled for an average of 6 years at $15,000 a year in tuition, the lifetime value of that one student comes out to $90,000, a 75-to-1 return. But every family that withdraws early resets that math back to zero. This is precisely why retention, not acquisition, is where the smartest operators spend their energy. A 5% improvement in how many families stay enrolled is usually worth more to the bottom line than an entire new marketing campaign, because retained families cost nothing extra to keep. Reputation itself functions as the school's core intangible asset, and it behaves like a bank account that's very slow to fill and instantly emptied. A strong reputation supports higher sticker tuition, deeper waiting lists, and the ability to recruit excellent teachers even while paying below the public school median. Because teachers are willing to trade some salary for prestige and working conditions. But that same reputation can be wiped out by a single serious incident: a safety failure, an academic cheating scandal, an admissions controversy faster than it was ever built, because online parent forums and school review sites now amplify bad news to every prospective family researching the school at 3 in the morning, long before the school's own communications team even hears about the problem. Now let's talk about two very different growth strategies, because the same basic idea, expand from one school into a whole network of schools, has produced one of the biggest recent success stories in American private education, and one of its most dramatic recent collapses, sometimes within the exact same age bracket of students, meet higher ground education. Founded in Southern California, it built its brand around Guidepost Montessori, a network that grew from 12 schools in 2018 to over 100 campuses across multiple countries by 2022. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of scalable education business that turns founders into wealthy people. A repeatable model, stamped out campus after campus, riding a wave of parent demand for Montessori-style early education, backed by outside investors who saw a business that could be replicated the way a coffee chain replicates a store format. Here's the problem: by the summer of 2025, Higher Ground Education filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court. Its own outgoing leadership put it bluntly in a public statement. In their eagerness to meet the vast vision of their mission, they had overextended themselves, growing the school network far beyond what they could actually support, financially or operationally. Nearly one-third of the entire school network was shut down almost overnight. In Denver alone, 5 campuses closed with no warning, leaving families with children as young as infants scrambling to find new care within weeks. In at least one location, teachers and students' personal belongings were reportedly left locked inside the building when it closed. Court filings from the bankruptcy listed over $13 million owed to a single financial creditor alone, alongside close to $1.5 million owed to individual landlords across multiple locations, and hundreds of thousands more owed to individual service providers. Why does a network like this collapse even though every individual school looked profitable enough on a spreadsheet to justify opening the next one? Because growth in education doesn't scale the way growth in a tech app does. Every new campus is a brand new building lease, a brand new staff to recruit and train, a brand new local licensing process, and a brand new break-even enrollment curve that takes years to climb, not months. Remember the break-even table from earlier in this script. A single mid-sized school needs somewhere close to 75% capacity just to survive. And getting from a freshly opened campus with a handful of enrolled toddlers up to that 75% mark can easily take 3 to 5 years of steady local marketing and reputation building. Adding schools faster than each individual campus can reach financial maturity means your fixed costs are compounding across the entire network, while your revenue is still crawling toward break even, campus by campus. By the time Higher Ground's board internally recognized the mismatch between growth ambition and operational capacity, the disagreement over whether to keep hyperscaling or slow down and stabilize had already split the company's own leadership, with the founder eventually departing the organization entirely before the bankruptcy filing. Now put that story right next to a completely different roll-up in the exact same segment of the market. Spring Education Group. Spring Education Group was built the opposite way. Instead of opening new, unproven campuses from scratch and hoping demand caught up, it grew almost entirely by acquiring already established, already profitable school brands and folding them under one ownership structure. Stratford School, LaPorte Montessori, Nobel Learning Communities, and Basis Independent Schools, among others, starting in 2017. Nobel Learning alone already had 25,000 students enrolled across 190 schools when it was folded in, meaning Spring wasn't betting on hypothetical future enrollment. It was buying enrollment that already existed, at campuses that had already survived their own break-even curve. Today, the combined group operates around 200 schools across 19 states and parts of Asia, backed by private equity capital, and despite weathering a Moody's credit downgrade during the pandemic, the network has continued to expand rather than collapse. Line the two stories up side by side, and the trap structure becomes obvious. Higher Ground grew by building new, unproven capacity faster than any single campus could reach maturity. Spring Education Group grew by buying capacity that had already proven itself financially. Both companies were consolidating a fragmented private school market under one ownership umbrella, but one was buying maturity and the other was manufacturing it on credit. Keep this in mind if anyone ever pitches you on rapid multi-campus expansion in education. The model that works beautifully for one school does not automatically work for the 10th school unless the 10th school is already standing on its own 2 feet before you acquire it. And overexpansion isn't the only way this goes wrong. Sometimes the trap is simpler: a single respected school taking on more debt than its enrollment can support. Manhattan Country School, a progressive private school on Manhattan's Upper West Side that had operated since 1966, filed for bankruptcy in 2025 while fighting possible foreclosure on its own building. The school ran on a sliding scale tuition model based on what each family could actually afford, capped at a maximum of $59,000 a year, already lower average revenue per student than a typical fixed tuition competitor, charging the same sticker price to every family regardless of income. Court filings listed assets and liabilities each somewhere between $10 million and $50 million. Reporting on the case traced the collapse back to an ambitious growth and renovation plan the school had taken on years earlier, one that assumed steady or rising enrollment and donations to service the debt on an expanded campus. When the pandemic hit and the school chose to reduce fees for struggling families rather than cut costs elsewhere, the math that had looked sound on paper stopped holding. And by the time leadership recognized the gap, the debt service obligations had already accumulated past the point that reduced tuition-era revenue could cover. The structural lesson is the same one from the break-even table earlier in this script. Debt service is a fixed cost. It does not care whether your enrollment is strong or your revenue model is generous to low-income families. A mission that reduces net tuition per student without a matching reduction in fixed obligations is mathematically the same as losing enrollment, just self-inflicted instead of accidental. A school that voluntarily cuts its own revenue per student during a downturn out of genuine compassion for struggling families is making the exact same financial move as a school that simply lost students to a recession. The intention is different. The balance sheet doesn't know the difference. There's a third failure pattern worth naming separately from overexpansion and debt, because it shows up constantly in smaller, single-campus schools that never make national headlines: the slow bleed. This is the school with no dramatic crisis, no bankruptcy filing, just a decade of enrollment drifting down by a handful of students a year, financial aid discounting creeping upward, and a head of school quietly deferring the roof repair and the HVAC replacement year after year to protect the bottom line. On paper, the school survives every year. In practice, the deferred maintenance compounds until the school merges with a stronger neighbor, gets acquired at a discount, or simply closes quietly over a summer. This is arguably the most common way private schools actually fail in America. Not with a bankruptcy court, but with a slow loss of the one asset propping up the tuition price all along: reputation. Let's also talk about what happens when the broader economy turns, because private education is often marketed as recession resistant, and that claim is only half true. Education is a non-discretionary priority for most parents, which does make private schools more resilient than, say, a luxury retail chain. But resilient is not the same as immune. During a downturn, late tuition payments rise as family cash flow tightens. Requests for financial aid spike sharply, sometimes pushing a school's average discount rate from a stable 15% past 20% within a single admission cycle. Families under real strain begin migrating toward a mid-tier private option or back to the free public system, and donation schools quietly rely on to smooth over rough years tend to contract sharply at exactly the moment they're needed most. None of these forces individually is fatal. Combined in a single bad year, they can push a healthy surplus into the exact insolvency zone we mapped out earlier. There's one more piece of this puzzle that almost never gets discussed until an owner is ready to retire or cash out. What is a school even worth, on paper, to someone else? A school can't really be valued off a quick multiple of revenue, since revenue per student varies too wildly by brand and geography. Buyers typically value it off a multiple of adjusted EBITDA instead: earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And for a single standalone K-12 school, that multiple typically lands somewhere between 4 and 8 times annual earnings, with larger networks in fast-growing markets commanding the high end. A school clearing $500,000 a year in adjusted earnings at a mid-range multiple of 6 is worth roughly $3 million as a going concern, on top of whatever the real estate itself is worth if sold separately. The true payoff of owning a school looks less like a business generating a paycheck every year, and more like a slow-growing tree that's worth very little in year 1 and a genuine fortune by year 30, provided it was never allowed to rot from the inside first. So, does any of this actually work? Let's run both versions of the ending, the way any honest operator has to. Here's the optimistic scenario. You open a mid-sized private school with capacity for 400 students. You hit 85% occupancy in your third year. A healthy, realistic number, not a fantasy one. That's 340 students, clearing roughly $12,300 in contribution per student, or about $4,180,000 in gross contribution. Subtract $3,690,000 in fixed costs, and you're left with an annual surplus of just under $500,000. Against a total startup investment of around $35 million, that surplus alone would take well over 70 years to pay back the initial capital, proof that a school is never a quick return investment. It's a real estate and brand equity play that pays off over decades, not years. Now here's the realistic scenario. A recession hits in year 4. Financial aid requests spike, pushing your discount rate from 15% past 20%, and enrollment slips as families migrate to free public schools. You drop from 340 students to 260. Contribution per student shrinks to roughly $10,000, and your total contribution falls to around $2,600,000. Nowhere near enough to cover fixed costs that haven't moved at all, because payroll, debt service, and the building lease don't get a recession discount. You're now underwater by close to $1 million in a single bad year. The difference between the good year and the bad year in this exact model is a swing of well over $1.5 million. On the same building, the same staff, and largely the same number of students, just a modest shift in occupancy and discounting. That's not a rounding error. That's the entire annual salary budget for dozens of teachers, disappearing or reappearing based on a swing in enrollment that could be as small as 80 students out of 400 seats. That's the entire business, distilled into one number. A private school is not one financial model. It's two financial models stacked on top of each other. One where you're comfortably profitable and one where you're in genuine distress, and the only thing separating them is a swing of a few dozen students and a few percentage points of financial aid. And unlike a factory that can idle a production line during a slow quarter, a school cannot simply stop teaching half its classrooms to save money without immediately damaging the exact reputation that justifies its tuition in the first place. So, can owning a school make you rich? sometimes but rarely quickly, and never by accident. The operators who treat a school as a fast cash-out vehicle, cutting teacher pay, packing classrooms, deferring maintenance, tend to accelerate exactly the enrollment decline that destroys the business. The same slow bleed that quietly ends far more schools than any single bankruptcy headline ever will. The ones who build real reputation, keep their occupancy in that safe 70 to 85% band, treat cash reserves as sacred, and grow only as fast as each individual campus can actually stand on its own, are the ones who are still standing decades later, running a campus that's now worth many times what it cost to build, with a waiting list that took 20 years to earn and could be undone in a single bad semester. A school isn't a cash machine. It's a very slow, very expensive bet on trust. And trust, unlike tuition, cannot be raised 5% a year just because the lease went up.